Ruth Eleanor Whitfield was 67 years old when she understood, with absolute and devastating clarity, that she had built her entire life on land that never belonged to her. She was sitting in the waiting room of Harrison & Cole Attorneys at Law on a Tuesday morning in February, wearing the blue dress that George had always said brought out the color of her eyes, her white hair pinned back in the way she had worn it for decades, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that did not reflect what was happening inside her chest. Around her, the leather chairs and mahogany bookshelves radiated the kind of expensive calm that expensive law firms cultivate deliberately, the kind that says, everything here is under control, everything here is orderly, everything here has been planned. Ruth had dressed carefully that morning. She had ironed the blue dress herself, which she rarely did anymore since her hands had developed a slight tremor in recent years, and she had taken particular care with her hair. It seemed important somehow to look composed, to look like a woman who was prepared for whatever came next. She was not prepared. George Whitfield had died 6 weeks earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in December, quietly and without any apparent drama. In the armchair in his study, where he spent most of his evenings, Ruth had brought him his tea at 4 o'clock as she always did, and he had already gone. The doctor said it was his heart. Peaceful, they said, as if that word was supposed to comfort her, as if the manner of his leaving somehow softened the fact of his absence. They had been married for 40 years. They had met when Ruth was 27, and working as a librarian at the public library, where George came every Wednesday afternoon to research case law. He was 42, 15 years her senior, recently divorced, with 2 children from his first marriage. He was serious, methodical, intelligent, in a way that expressed itself through precision rather than warmth. He asked her to dinner after 3 months of Wednesday afternoons. He asked her to marry him after 1 year. She said yes to both invitations, believing she had found a man of substance, a man who would be steady when the world was not. His children, Daniel and Carolyn, had made their position clear from the beginning. Daniel was 20 when his father remarried, already studying law like his father before him. Carolyn was 18, sharp-tongued and watchful. Neither of them called Ruth their stepmother, not once in 40 years. She was always George's wife, or simply Ruth, pronounced with a particular flatness that drained the name of any warmth. They came to family events with the compliance of people fulfilling an obligation, smiled with their mouths but not their eyes, and departed as quickly as politeness allowed. Ruth had tried. This is the thing that would haunt her afterward, not the loss of the money or the house or the security, but the memory of how hard she had tried. She had remembered every birthday, every anniversary of Daniel's children, every school play and graduation. She had sent thoughtful gifts, written careful cards, organized holiday dinners where she cooked for 12 people who regarded her across the table with polite indifference. She had bit her tongue through 40 years of small cruelties, the comments about her modest background, the jokes that weren't quite jokes about the age difference, the way Carolyn would sometimes speak about George's first wife in front of her, as if Ruth were not in the room. George had never intervened. This was something Ruth had understood about her husband early in the marriage, and had simply accepted the way you accept weather. He was conflict-averse in the particular way that intelligent men sometimes are, men who use their intelligence to rationalize avoidance as wisdom. He would say afterward in private that he was sorry about something Carolyn had said. He would squeeze Ruth's hand and call her his anchor, but he would not say anything to Carolyn. They had lived well. In a large Victorian house in the Westmore neighborhood that George had owned before their marriage, Ruth had transformed that house over 40 years into something genuinely beautiful. She had chosen every piece of furniture, every curtain, every plant in the garden. She had maintained it, repaired it, improved it, with the care of someone who understood that a home is a living thing that requires constant attention. She had raised the garden from bare beds to something that people stopped to photograph in summer. She had painted the interior herself 3 times over 4 decades, but the house was George's. The bank accounts were George's. The investments, the retirement funds, the car, all of it was in George's name, as had seemed entirely natural in 1984 when they married, as had seemed entirely natural through the years that followed, because George managed the finances, and Ruth managed everything else, and this division had seemed, if not equal, at least functional. She understood now, sitting in the waiting room of Harrison & Cole, that functional was not the same as safe. Thomas Harrison himself conducted the reading of the will. He was a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and the carefully neutral expression of someone who had delivered difficult news on many occasions and had developed, over time, a professional compassion that was genuine but contained. Daniel and Carolyn sat on one side of the long conference table with their respective spouses. They had arrived together in Daniel's car, and they had positioned themselves in the room with the unconscious confidence of people who expected good news. Daniel had a yellow legal pad in front of him. Carolyn had already removed a pen from her handbag. Ruth sat across from them, alone. Thomas Harrison cleared his throat and began. The estate of George Whitfield was valued at approximately $6.4 million. This included the Victorian house in Westmore, valued at $1.8 million. Investment accounts totaling approximately $3.2 million. A retirement fund of approximately $900,000, and several smaller assets. Ruth felt, absurdly, a wave of relief. $6.4 million was more than enough. It was more than she had imagined. George had been careful, she had always known that, careful and methodical about money as about everything else. Whatever he had arranged, it would be sufficient. It would be more than sufficient. Thomas Harrison continued reading. The Victorian house in Westmore was to be transferred in its entirety to Daniel and Carolyn Whitfield, to be divided equally between them or sold, and the proceeds split as they saw fit. The wave of relief collapsed. The investment accounts, totaling $3.2 million, were to be distributed equally between Daniel and Carolyn Whitfield. The retirement fund was to be distributed equally between Daniel and Carolyn Whitfield. Across the table, Carolyn was already writing something on a notepad she had produced from her handbag. Daniel was nodding slowly, with the careful composure of a man trying not to smile. Thomas Harrison paused, and Ruth heard in that pause all the apology he could not professionally express. He read the next section in a voice that was noticeably quieter. George's will stated that his wife, Ruth Eleanor Whitfield, had been provided with a comfortable life for 40 years and had benefited from his income, his home, and his social standing throughout their marriage, and that this constituted adequate compensation for her companionship and domestic contributions. His primary obligation, the will stated, was to his children and to the continuation of the Whitfield family. Therefore, to Ruth, he left a single asset, a property located at 12 Briarwood Road in the town of Caldwell, Vermont, along with all contents therein. Ruth was expected to vacate the Westmore house within 30 days. The silence in the conference room was the loudest thing Ruth had ever heard. Domestic contributions. She had known this man for 40 years. She had ironed his shirts and held his hand through his mother's death, and stayed awake worrying when he traveled, and made 10,000 small decisions every day that kept his life running smoothly, and he had reduced all of that to domestic contributions. Carolyn broke the silence with an expression of theatrical sympathy. She said that she vaguely remembered their father mentioning the Vermont property once, something he inherited from a distant cousin years ago. A rundown old place in the middle of nowhere, she said, barely worth the property taxes. She smiled at Ruth with a pity that did not reach her eyes. At least you'll have a roof over your head. Daniel was already consulting his phone, probably calculating real estate values. He mentioned, without looking up, that they would need to discuss the timeline for vacating the Westmore house, as they intended to list it as quickly as possible. Thomas Harrison slid a brown envelope across the table. His hand was steady, but his eyes, when they met Ruth's, said something that his professional obligations prevented him from speaking aloud. Inside the envelope was a property deed, a small iron key that looked older than the century, and a handwritten note in George's precise, cramped script. 12 Briarwood Road, Caldwell, Vermont. Ruth, go there, go soon. I could not tell you before, I could not risk it. Trust me one last time. All my love, always, George. She folded the note. She put it back in the envelope. She stood up, and she walked out of the conference room without speaking another word to Daniel or Carolyn, because if she opened her mouth, she did not know what would come out of it. And she had maintained her dignity for 40 years, and she intended to maintain it for the duration of the walk to her car. She made it to the parking garage before she sat down on a concrete step and pressed her hands over her face and breathed in the specific way her doctor had told her to breathe when she felt her heart racing, slow and deliberate, in through the nose, out through the mouth until the world stopped tilting. She was 67 years old. She had not worked since 1984. She had approximately $3,000 in a personal checking account that George had given her for household expenses. She had a 40-year-old iron key and an address in a state she had not visited in 30 years. She drove home to the house she had made beautiful over 4 decades, and she began, methodically, and without allowing herself to think too deeply about what she was doing, to pack. The 30 days that followed had a particular quality of surreal cruelty. Daniel came to the house twice with a real estate agent, and both times they moved through the rooms discussing staging and market positioning, while Ruth was still there, while her clothes were still in the closets and her books were still on the shelves. The real estate agent suggested removing the garden furniture from the back terrace because it was dated. That garden furniture had been Ruth's anniversary present to herself 7 years ago. She had driven 40 minutes to find exactly the right pieces. Carolyn came once, ostensibly to collect some items that had belonged to her mother, objects that had lived in the Westmore house throughout Ruth's entire tenure there, objects Ruth had dusted and polished and carefully preserved for 40 years without once considering that they might someday be used as a reason to enter a room she still occupied. Carolyn moved through the house with a measuring quality in her gaze, like someone taking mental inventory. She paused in the kitchen and said, almost conversationally, that she supposed Ruth had not thought much about what she would do in Vermont. "Not much to do in a small town at your age," she said. "No offense." Ruth said nothing. She packed 3 suitcases and 4 boxes. She left behind everything that had been chosen to fit the life George wanted to project: the formal dining set, the artwork he had selected, the china they used when his colleagues came to dinner. She took her mother's recipe box, her grandmother's quilt, the small collection of poetry books she had loved before she married and returned to rarely in the years after. She took the photographs that included only herself and no one else, pictures that proved she had existed as a person before she became someone's wife. She took the blue dress and 2 others. She left the rest. On the 29th day, with Daniel's car already visible at the end of the street when she pulled out of the driveway, Ruth Eleanor Whitfield drove north toward Vermont, with her entire life in the trunk of a 10-year-old Honda and an address that meant nothing to her. She cried for approximately the first hour. Then she stopped because crying while driving on the highway is dangerous, and she had already lost enough. She did not intend to lose anything else. Coldwell, Vermont, was smaller than she expected, and quieter than she expected, and in a way she did not immediately have the language to describe, more beautiful than she expected. She arrived in the late afternoon of a February day, which meant the light was already going golden and long against the snow-covered hills, and the town's main street, which was genuinely only about 200 meters long, was lit up against the early dark with the warm light coming from shop windows, a hardware store, a small grocery with hand-lettered signs, a diner with a neon coffee cup in the window, a post office that appeared to have been built during the previous century, a library, a church. As she drove slowly through looking for Briarwood Road, she noticed that people looked up. Not with suspicion, she would think later, but with the particular attentiveness of a small community where arrivals are noted. An elderly man outside the hardware store watched her car pass. A woman coming out of the grocery with a bag in each arm turned to watch. A teenage boy on the library steps lowered his phone. The GPS took her down a side street, then onto a road that became increasingly unpaved as she drove, lined on both sides by birch trees, whose white bark caught the last light and held it. The road was rough, and she had to drive slowly. After what felt longer than it probably was, the trees opened into a clearing and she stopped the car. The house at 12 Briarwood Road was not what Carolyn had described. It was old, certainly. The clapboard siding had weathered to a silver grey that might once have been white. One shutter on an upstairs window hung at an angle. The porch railing had rotted through in 2 places. The yard was a tangle of dead growth and old snow. A massive maple tree dominated the front, its bare branches spreading across the roof and the sky above it like something drawn by hand. but the bones of it were solid. She could see that immediately, even in the failing light, even through the neglect. The foundation was stone, the chimney was intact. The structure itself stood with the particular stubbornness of a building that was made to last and had simply been left alone for too long. She sat in the car and looked at it for a long time. Then she got out, took the iron key from the brown envelope in her handbag, walked up the porch steps, which held her weight, and unlocked the front door. The smell of a house that has been closed for a long time came out to meet her, dry and dusty and cold, but not damp, not rotten. She stepped inside and found a light switch and was surprised when the lights came on. Not warm light, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling of the entryway, but light nonetheless. The interior was a version of what the exterior had prepared her for, old, dusty, plainly furnished, but structurally intact. Hardwood floors under a thick layer of dust that might, she thought, be beautiful once cleaned. A stone fireplace that took up most of one wall of the main room. Windows that were larger than she expected, 4 of them across the front of the house, so that in daylight the room would be full of light. Built-in bookshelves on 2 walls empty, a kitchen that was small and outdated, but complete. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that had probably been modern once and was now simply old enough to be interesting again. And on the kitchen table, placed with obvious intention, a white envelope with her name written on it in a hand she did not recognize. She picked it up. Inside was a folded note. "Welcome to Coldwell. You were expected. I have left some things in the refrigerator. Please come by the diner in the morning. I'll explain what I can. My name is Marjorie Flood, and I have been waiting for you for quite some time. There are extra blankets in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed upstairs, and the furnace works, but you'll need to turn it on manually. The switch is in the basement beside the stairs." Ruth read the note twice. Then she went to the basement and found the furnace switch. Then she went to the refrigerator and found milk, eggs, bread, butter, and a container of soup that was still warm. She heated the soup. She ate it standing at the kitchen counter in her coat because the house had not yet warmed up. Then she went upstairs, found the blankets in the cedar chest exactly where Marjorie Flood had said they would be, and she lay down on the old mattress in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, with her coat still on and her eyes open, looking at the ceiling, and she thought about the fact that a stranger had left her warm soup and clear instructions, and that this was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in longer than she could easily remember. She slept. Marjorie Flood was 73 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and direct in the manner of someone who had decided somewhere in her 50s that life was too short for indirection. She had run the Coldwell Diner for 30 years, and she knew everything about everyone in town, a fact she acknowledged without apology. She was waiting at a corner table when Ruth came in at 8 the next morning, and she stood up and took Ruth's hand in both of hers with the warmth of someone greeting a person they already knew. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get coffee. Then I'll tell you about George." Ruth sat. "George Whitfield had been coming to Coldwell for 32 years, Marjorie said. "He came 6 or 8 times a year, sometimes more. He always stayed at the Briarwood house, which he had inherited from his cousin Margaret in 1991, and which he had over the years maintained quietly and without fanfare. He paid local people to keep the yard managed, the roof in good repair, the furnace working. He kept the utilities connected and paid the taxes without fail. He came alone," Marjorie said, "always alone. And he sat in this corner of the diner, and he talked to her about Ruth." Ruth put her coffee cup down. "He talked about her constantly," Marjorie said without sentimentality, in the plain tone of someone reporting facts. "He said she was the most capable person he had ever known. He said she had made his house into a home when he hadn't understood the difference. He said he was not good at saying the right things, and he knew it, and he regretted it. He said his children had never accepted her, and he had handled that badly, had always handled it badly, and it was one of the things he was most ashamed of. He said that leaving her the Briarwood house was the most important thing he had ever done, and the most carefully considered." "Why?" Ruth asked. "Why didn't he tell me? Why hide it for 30 years? "Because of Daniel and Carolyn," Marjorie said simply. "He was a lawyer. He understood how these things could be contested. He understood that if his children knew this property existed, They would find a legal argument for claiming it as a marital asset subject to division. He had structured the deed very specifically to prevent that, had transferred the property into a separate legal entity years before he intended to include it in his will, but he was afraid that if you knew, you might mention it or they might find out some other way. He was afraid they would challenge it while he was still alive, when it could still be undone. He was afraid, Ruth said. Yes, said Marjorie. He was afraid of them. She paused. He was afraid of conflict, generally. She said it without judgment, which Ruth appreciated, because it was true, and she had known it for 40 years, and it was a complicated thing to hold, the truth about someone you had loved. He left a letter, Marjorie said. He gave it to me to give to you. He said you would come eventually. He said you would find your way here. She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced an envelope, thick, cream-colored, sealed with wax, George's handwriting on the front. Ruth's name and beneath it a single line, "For when you are ready. Not before." Ruth carried the letter back to the house. She sat in the main room in front of the fireplace, which she had managed to light that morning after some difficulty and a certain amount of newspaper, and she held the envelope for a long time before she opened it. "My dearest Ruth," it began, and the formality of those 3 words, so unlike the way George usually spoke, told her immediately that he had thought carefully about every word that followed. He wrote that he knew what the will had looked like from the outside. He knew what it had felt like to sit in that room and hear herself described in terms that stripped 40 years down to a service transaction. He was sorry for that, deeply sorry, and he asked her to understand that he had written it that way deliberately. He had written it to give Daniel and Carolyn exactly the kind of language they would have expected from him, the language that would satisfy them, the language that would make them believe they had won. If the will had shown any warmth toward Ruth, any real provision, they would have looked deeper. They would have found Briarwood. They would have contested it in every court available to them. And they had the money and the legal connections to make that process very long and very damaging. So he had given them the visible assets, all the things they had always wanted, the house, the accounts, the investments, everything they would consider worth fighting over. And he had given them those things wrapped in structures he had spent years carefully designing. The investment accounts were locked in trusts requiring annual character reviews conducted by an independent board. The Westmore house carried historic preservation requirements he had added to the deed a decade ago, requirements that would make any renovation expensive and any quick sale nearly impossible, and the house itself carried a mortgage he had taken out 2 years before his death, which the heirs had just inherited. The retirement fund was structured so that distributions were taxed in the most disadvantageous way legally possible. He had given his children everything they thought they wanted, arranged to make them as miserable as the law allowed. And to Ruth he had given Briarwood. The property, he wrote, sat on 83 acres of Vermont woodland. He had commissioned an independent appraisal 18 months before his death. The land alone was valued at approximately $2.1 million by a conservation trust that had already expressed serious interest in purchasing the development rights. The house, as a historic structure, carried an additional value of approximately $400,000. He had established a maintenance trust that would cover property taxes, utilities, and basic upkeep for the next 40 years. The account for this trust held approximately $200,000 and was invested conservatively. She would never have to worry about the cost of keeping the house. It was hers entirely, structured as a separate property gift that predated the marriage and could not be challenged as a marital asset. His lawyers, he wrote, had confirmed this was bulletproof. If Daniel or Carolyn tried to contest it, they would find themselves fighting against 30 years of careful legal preparation. But, he wrote, and she could hear in that single word all his characteristic tendency to understate, the most important thing about Briarwood was not the money. He had come there for 30 years because it was the only place he knew how to be himself, away from his reputation, away from his children's expectations, away from the pressure of being George Whitfield the attorney, George Whitfield the Westmore resident, George Whitfield who had to maintain a particular image, because too many people depended on that image for their own sense of order. At Briarwood, he said, he had just been a man who chopped wood badly and made poor coffee and sat on the porch watching the seasons change and thought about what really mattered. What really mattered was her. He had not been good at showing this. He acknowledged it plainly, without excuses, which was in itself something she had rarely heard from him. He had been conflict-averse and emotionally restrained, and too concerned with keeping surfaces smooth to do the harder work of protecting the person he loved most. He had failed her in this. He would not insult her by pretending otherwise, but he had done what he could do, which was plan. He was better at planning than at feeling, or at least at expressing feeling. He had planned Briarwood for 30 years. He had maintained it and protected it and kept it safe for her with the same care that he should have shown her in daylight, publicly, when it would have cost him something. He was sorry he had not been braver, he wrote. He was sorry it had taken his death to say what he should have said while he was alive. He loved her. He had always loved her. She was the only person in his life who had ever loved him back, simply because of who he was, rather than what he could provide. And he had spent 40 years being quietly, privately, genuinely grateful for that, even when he expressed it badly or not at all. The house was hers. Coldwell was hers. Whatever she chose to do with the years she had left was hers entirely. He hoped she would stay long enough to let the town become home, because the people there were good people, and they already knew her name, because he had talked about her often enough that she was in some sense already known. He loved her. He was sorry. He trusted her to be fine. All my love, always, George. Ruth sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The fire had burned down to coals. The light in the room had shifted as the sun moved. She was aware of crying and not caring that she was crying, alone in a house that was hers in a town she had arrived in yesterday, surrounded by 30 years of her husband's quiet, inadequate, genuine love. He had been imperfect. She did not need the letter to tell her that. He had been weak in the ways that had hurt her most, the public silences, the failure to defend her, the years of allowing his children to treat her as peripheral when she was fundamental. She did not forgive all of it simply because the letter explained it. Forgiveness, she understood at 67, was not a single decision, but a long practice, and she had time. She also had 83 acres of Vermont woodland, and the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. She called Marcus Chen, George's attorney, the following morning. He confirmed everything in the letter. The property structure was solid. The maintenance trust was funded. If Daniel or Carolyn contested the bequest, they would be contesting a legal arrangement 30 years in the making, and he was confident they would not prevail. He advised her to retain her own attorney, recommended someone in Montpellier, and said that she should prepare herself for an attempt, but not be frightened by it. She was not frightened. This surprised her somewhat. She thought she should feel frightened, thought the combination of uncertainty and legal threat and financial complexity would produce in her the same breathless terror that had kept her awake through the 30 days in Westmore. Instead, she felt something that she might, cautiously, have called clarity. She had very little. She had a house that needed significant work. She had a small town she did not know. She had a letter from a man she was still deciding how to understand. She also had nothing left to lose, and she had learned in her weeks of packing and enduring that nothing left to lose is a different thing than she had always imagined. It is not despair. It is, strangely, a kind of freedom. The people of Coldwell came to her, gradually and without overwhelming her. Marjorie was the anchor. She appeared every 2 or 3 days with food or information, or simply company, and she did not fill silence with unnecessary conversation, which Ruth appreciated deeply. Through Marjorie, she met the others. Frank Okafor, who ran the hardware store and who turned out to have a professional background in carpentry before he retired to Coldwell and bought the shop, came to look at the porch railing and the shutters, and spent an afternoon showing her what would need to be done and what she could reasonably do herself. He did not offer to do it for her, which she also appreciated. There was Helen Marsh, who taught at the elementary school, and who knocked on Ruth's door one Saturday morning with a jar of maple syrup and an apology for not coming sooner. There was the minister from the White Church, a quiet man named Paul, who had heard from Marjorie that she had arrived and wanted simply to say that the church had a small library and she was welcome to come and use it. There was a young woman named Jade, 29, who was the town's part-time librarian and part-time website designer, and who had grown up in Coldwell and come back after a decade in Boston, and who looked at Ruth with the open curiosity of someone who found older women genuinely interesting rather than merely polite. Each of them told her something about George, not because they had organized a campaign to improve her understanding of her husband, but because he had been a presence in their lives, and they spoke about him naturally, the way you speak about someone who mattered. Frank said George had helped him negotiate the lease for the hardware store 9 years ago, had done it without charging him, had shown up with a draft document, and said a man who knows wood should have a place to work. Helen said George had donated anonymously to the school library for years, had simply arranged for a check to arrive every September without any accompanying paperwork requiring acknowledgement. Paul said George had sat in his church on occasional Sundays and seemed to find it useful, and that they had talked sometimes about the weight of having made choices you regretted, which Paul said George carried heavily. The picture that emerged was of a man Ruth recognized and did not recognize simultaneously. The intelligence and the precision and the methodical quality, those were familiar. The generosity was less familiar, or rather she had not seen it directed outward in this way, had not known that he had this capacity for quiet giving without requiring recognition. In Boston, generosity had always been calibrated and visible. Here it had apparently been something else. She worked on the house. This surprised her. The degree to which the physical work became something she needed rather than something she was simply required to do. She started with what she could manage alone, cleaning, methodically, room by room, and discovering as she cleaned what was worth keeping and what was simply old. The floors, under the dust, were extraordinary, wide plank pine that had darkened over a century to a deep honey color. The stone fireplace was structurally perfect. The windows, when cleaned, filled the main room with a quality of light that was almost architectural. Frank came on weekends to help with the structural work she could not do herself. He did not charge her the going rate, which she argued with him about and lost. He said George had never charged him the going rate either, and he considered it a debt he was now repaying, which she could not effectively counter. She hired 2 young men from town to help clear the yard, which revealed gradually the bones of what had once been a considered landscape. A stone wall, mostly intact, that she had not known was there under the overgrowth. A path of flat stepping stones leading to the back of the property, where the land opened to a view of the hills, that she stood and looked at for a long time the first time she found it. An old apple orchard, 6 trees, probably 50 years old, untended for years but still standing, still alive. She planted things. First inside, starting seeds on the windowsill because it was still February, and Vermont in February is not a place for outdoor planting, but she needed to start. She drove to a nursery in the next town and bought seed packets and small pots and potting soil, and she arranged them in the window of the kitchen and checked on them every morning in the way she had checked on her garden in Westmore for 4 decades, with the same satisfaction in small signs of progress that had always been one of the reliable pleasures of her life. She began to understand that this pleasure, the pleasure of growing things, of tending and watching and waiting, was something that had never required George or the children or Westmore or any of the structures she had organized herself around. It was simply hers, had been hers all along, and it would be hers here. The legal challenge came 3 weeks after her arrival, as Marcus had predicted it would. A letter from Daniel's law firm claiming that the Briarwood property, regardless of its formal structure, should be considered a marital asset subject to equitable distribution, and that Ruth's failure to disclose the property during the probate process constituted an actionable omission. Ruth read the letter twice, then called the attorney Marcus had recommended in Montpelier, a woman named Sandra Reyes who turned out to be exactly the kind of person you want on your side, in a legal dispute, methodical, direct, and not in the slightest intimidated by expensive law firms in Boston. "This is manageable," Sandra said. "Your husband structured this carefully. They're making an argument that has been tried before in Vermont courts and has not generally succeeded when the original transfer was clean." She asked Ruth to send all the documents George had included in the file at Briarwood, the 30-year-old deed, the trust documentation, the maintenance fund structure. Ruth sent everything. She also, in the process of reviewing those documents, found something else George had left in the filing cabinet in the small office off the kitchen. A folder labeled simply "Additional," containing documentation of the trust structures he had established for Daniel and Carolyn's inheritances, with handwritten annotations explaining exactly what each restriction was designed to accomplish. She saw it clearly then, the complete picture. Daniel's investment accounts locked in structures requiring proof of continuous employment and annual character reviews. Carolyn's trust conditioned on maintaining stable family relationships, which George had noted would be difficult given her 3 divorces and the estrangement from her own adult children. The Westmore house loaded with preservation requirements, a recent mortgage, and restrictions on rapid sale that would tie them in committees and inspections for months. George had not only protected her, he had also, with 30 years of patient legal precision, built a series of very elegant traps for the people who had spent 40 years making his wife feel like a guest in her own life. She did not feel triumphant exactly. She felt something more complicated, a mixture of understanding and sadness, and a very specific appreciation for the intelligence of a man she had loved in a complicated way for a very long time. She called Sandra back. She said, "I have some additional documents I think you should see, and I have an idea about how I want to handle this." When Daniel and Carolyn arrived in Coldwell, it was a Saturday in March. The snow had begun to melt, and the maple on the front of the house was just beginning to show the first signs of buds. They came in Daniel's car, a large, dark Mercedes that looked expensive and out of place on the Briarwood Road. Ruth watched them from the upstairs window as they got out and stood looking at the house, and she saw in their faces the same recalculation she had experienced herself when she first arrived, a forced revision of what they had expected. She went downstairs and opened the door before they knocked. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." She made tea and set it out with the good cups she had found in the back of the kitchen cupboard, and she sat across from them in the main room by the fireplace, which was burning, and she was calm in a way she had not planned to be, but discovered she was. Daniel said they wanted to talk about the property situation. He used the word situation, which she noticed. He said they had concerns about the legal structure of the bequest, and believed there were grounds for a reasonable conversation about how the estate assets had been divided. Carolyn said they were not there to be hostile. She said it with a tone that suggested the opposite possibility was very much on the table. Ruth listened to all of this. Then she set down her cup. She said, "I understand what you're doing, and I want to tell you something honestly because I think you deserve honesty, even if it hasn't always been offered to you in situations like this. Your father planned all of this very carefully. This property has been legally mine for 30 years. That is not going to change regardless of what your attorneys argue." She paused. She said, "I also want to tell you something else. Your father left documentation about the trust structures he created for your inheritances. I've read them. I understand exactly what you're going to discover when you try to access that money, and I know what the Westmore house is going to cost you to maintain and sell." Carolyn's expression shifted. Ruth continued, "I'm not going to threaten you. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to use any of the information your father left me as a weapon. That's not who I am, and frankly, it's not what he would have wanted. He kept that information because he was a lawyer, and lawyers document things, not because he intended it to be used against you. But I am going to ask you to make a choice." She folded her hands on her lap. "You can pursue this legal challenge and spend the next year in depositions and hearings arguing against 30 years of careful legal preparation. And at the end of it, you will still not have this property, and you will have spent significant money and time and energy on a case you will not win. Or you can accept what your father arranged, which was designed, I believe, to give each of us what we actually needed, rather than what we thought we wanted." She looked at Daniel and then at Carolyn. She said, "I'm not your enemy. I was never your enemy. I spent 40 years trying not to be your enemy, with mixed results that I am not entirely without responsibility for myself. I am simply a 67-year-old woman who has finally found a place where I belong. I would very much like to be left alone to belong there." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird called from the maple tree. Daniel said he needed to speak with Carolyn privately. "Of course," said Ruth. She stood, and she walked to the kitchen, and she stood at the window looking at the remains of the snow in the yard and at the 6 apple trees beginning to emerge from winter, and she thought about what George had written. That she would be fine, that he trusted her to be fine. She was fine. 3 weeks later, Sandra called to tell her that Daniel's law firm had withdrawn the legal challenge. The probate was closed. 12. Briarwood Road, Coldwell, Vermont, 83 acres and 1 house with a clawfoot tub, was definitively and entirely hers. She went out to the yard when she got off the phone, and she stood under the maple tree and looked up through the budding branches at the Vermont sky, which in late March is a particular shade of blue that seems to belong to a different atmosphere than the sky over a city. And she stood there until she was cold, and then she went inside and started a fire and made dinner. Summer came slowly in Vermont, and then all at once, which she found she loved. The apple trees bloomed in May, and she stood in the orchard for a long time the first morning she noticed it, surrounded by blossoms, in a way that felt more like arrival than anything that had happened since she drove up the Briarwood Road in February. The garden she had planted from seeds in the kitchen window was transplanted to beds she prepared herself along the south side of the house, beds that had clearly been cultivated once and were waiting to be cultivated again. She put in herbs first, the ones she had always grown in Westmore, rosemary and thyme and mint and basil, and then vegetables, tomatoes and beans and squash, and then flowers, because a garden without flowers is only half a garden. Marjorie came on Tuesdays. Frank came on Saturdays when there was still work to be done on the house, and now sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk, which Ruth found she valued. Jade, the young librarian, had started coming by occasionally with books she thought Ruth would like, a habit that had begun with professional intent and evolved into something that resembled friendship, the kind that crosses generations when both people are curious and honest. Helen Marsh brought her daughter, 7 years old, who was entranced by the garden in a way that reminded Ruth of herself at that age, and who asked careful questions about why different plants were planted in different places, and who Ruth found she was delighted to explain these things to. She had not expected, at 67, to find herself in the middle of a community that was making room for her. She had assumed, in the abstract, that belonging to a place was something that happened in youth and then either persisted or didn't. She had not considered that belonging might be something you arrived at late, and that arriving at it late might mean arriving at it more fully, because you understood better what it meant. She began, tentatively, to think about the future in a way that was not purely defensive. The land, Marjorie had mentioned, was of interest to a conservation organization based in Montpellier. They would pay well for a conservation easement that would protect the woodland permanently, while allowing Ruth to remain on the property. She did not need to sell the land to benefit from its value. She made an appointment to talk with them. She also, in the evenings, began to write. She had always kept a journal intermittently through her adult life, but in Westmore there had been an instinctive caution about what she committed to paper, a sense that her inner life should be kept small and hidden. Here, alone in the evenings with the fire going and the Vermont dark outside the windows, she wrote without caution. She wrote about the 40 years, about what she had given and what she had received, and what she understood differently now. About George, the complicated man who had loved her in the most inadequate and ultimately extraordinary way he knew how. About what it felt like to be 67 and starting over and discovering that starting over was not actually the diminishment she had feared. She wrote about the morning she had stood in the Briarwood kitchen in her coat and eaten warm soup left by a stranger and felt, for the first time in months, that she might be all right. In September, she found another envelope. She had been reorganizing the small office, the room off the kitchen with the filing cabinet and George's old desk, turning it gradually into a room she could work in rather than a room that felt like a museum of someone else's habits. Behind the filing cabinet, where it must have slipped and been forgotten or left deliberately, she was not sure which, she found an envelope marked simply Ruth, when you're ready to stay. Inside was the deed to an additional 12 acres to the north of the property. A piece of land she had not known was included, and a note from George that was shorter than the letter, barely a page, and which said, "I bought this piece when it became available 6 years ago because I thought you might want the space. There is a small barn on it. You could do anything with a barn. You always could do anything. I just hope you finally know it." She sat at George's desk and held the note and thought about a man who had bought land for her 6 years ago against the day when she would need it, who had prepared for her future with the same methodical attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and who had expressed this love in the only way that finally seemed real to her, not in words spoken at the right time, but in 30 years of patient, private, absolutely concrete action. He had not been the husband she sometimes wished she had. He had been the husband she actually had, imperfect and careful, and ultimately, in his way, devoted. She thought about the barn. She had an idea. Jade had mentioned several times that Coldwell had no gathering space for the kinds of events that a small community needs. A book group that met in the library but had outgrown it. A craft circle that met in someone's living room. An occasional speaker who came through and had nowhere suitable to present. Young people who sometimes drove 40 minutes to the next town for something to do. A barn could hold a book group. A barn could hold a craft circle. A barn could hold a lecture on any subject someone cared to give. A barn could be, with the right attention, a kind of community room that the town did not have. She talked to Marjorie about it, then to Jade, then to Frank, who walked up to the North Piece with her on an October afternoon when the hills were the kind of red and orange that make people drive hours to witness, and who looked at the barn and said he thought it was a good structure, that the frame was sound, that it would need a new roof and better insulation and some electrical work, and that he knew people who could help. She began to plan. She was, she discovered, surprisingly good at planning. 40 years of running a complicated household, of managing events and logistics and the needs of multiple people simultaneously, had given her skills she had never thought of as skills because they had been invisible. Because that was the nature of domestic competence, it was only noticed when it was absent. She applied for a small grant from the State Arts Council. She talked to the conservation organization about the easement, which they finalized in November, and which provided her with the resources to fund the barn project and to maintain the property for the foreseeable future without anxiety. She hired Frank and 2 of his recommended colleagues, and they began work on the barn in early spring. She named it the Briarwood Community House, which was practical rather than poetic, but which everyone in Coldwell immediately shortened to the Briarwood, so that it became a place name rather than just a name, which was what she had hoped for. On the day it opened, the following September, with a book group in the afternoon and a potluck supper in the evening, and more people than she had expected in both cases, Ruth Eleanor Whitfield stood in the doorway of a barn she had transformed in a town she had arrived in with everything lost, and she thought about the woman who had sat in a parking garage in Boston in February and pressed her hands over her face and tried to breathe. She would tell that woman, if she could, that the worst moment was the prelude, that the stripping away of everything she had organized her life around was not the end of the story, but the precondition for a different one. That belonging, when you finally find it, feels like something you made rather than something that was given to you. That 67 is not the end of anything. She would tell her that the house on Briarwood Road needed her in the same way she needed it, that a house abandoned is not the same as a house dead, that both can be brought back by the right attention at the right time. She would tell her to drive north, to knock on Marjorie Flood's door, to eat the soup left by a stranger and trust that there are strangers who become something else. She would tell her that she was going to be fine. She was, she understood now, considerably more than fine. She was home.